Okay, I'm going to start the webinar now. Good evening and welcome. Tonight on the line, I'll be talking to Stefanie Linden about the impact of trauma after World War I, which is going to be a summary of her book available through Hellion Books. But as usual, before we get started, if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A, which is at the box at the bottom of your screen. And also we must give a shout out to our funders, the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust. So without further, and we've had a slight technical hitch, which is why we're starting with the PowerPoint this evening. But without further ado, Stefanie, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here today. And yeah, would you like me to start my
Yes, yes,
oh,
please.
Great. Okay, so we're starting straight away. Great. So yeah, today I would like to take you on a journey from the battlefields of the First World War to the home hospitals in Britain and Germany, from the very beginning of the conflict to the time after the Armistice, from fighting and trench life to the period of transitioning into civilian life. The protagonists of the story are the soldiers who fought on different sides of the trenches, and also the civilians, men, women, and children who were deeply affected by the war. So we will start the journey in the middle of our timeline on the 11th of November 1920, 2 years after the Armistice. On this day, large crowds assembled in the streets outside London's Victoria Station. The train with the body of the unknown warrior had arrived on platform 8 the night before. Those who had obtained a favorable place on the platforms could catch a glimpse of the coffin inside the railway carriage, and which had been decorated with flowers and wreaths. The idea of the tomb of the unknown warrior had already been born in 1916. While serving on the Western Front, an army chaplain had stumbled upon a grave marked by a rough cross with a pencil inscription, "An unknown British soldier." This encounter made such an impression upon him that he wrote to the Dean of Westminster proposing that an unidentified British soldier from the battlefields in France be buried with due ceremony in Westminster Abbey to represent the many fallen soldiers of the empire. So, yeah, while the first part of the warrior's journey from the battlefields of the Western Front to Victoria Station was only witnessed by a few, its final part was to be shared with the whole nation. On the morning of Armistice Day, 1920, the coffin was lifted on a gun carriage and the grand procession passed through Grosvenor Place, Constitution Hill, past Buckingham Palace and the Victoria Memorial, through the Mall towards Trafalgar Square, and then into Whitehall. When the carriage arrived at the cenotaph, the king stepped forward and laid a wreath of bay leaves and red roses with a card on which he had written, "In proud memory of those who died, unknown in the Great War, unknown and yet well known, as dying and behold, they live." When Big Ben began to strike the 11th hour, the king turned to the cenotaph and released the flags which had concealed it. When Big Ben ceased, the very pulse of time stood still, and the great silence was shared by millions of Britons throughout the United Kingdom and the British Empire. So the unknown warrior found his final resting place in Westminster Abbey. Among the congregation were 100 women who had each lost their husband and all their sons in the war. This moving ceremony hopefully brought some closure to the bereaved families. However, even with a distance of 2 years, the war continued to produce new suffering. On the 11th of November 1920, the soldiers who never returned from the battlefields were remembered by a whole nation. Yet, what happened to those who were lucky enough to survive and return into their old lives, to their wives, children, homes, and businesses? Not very far from the ceremony, the long-term casualties of the war were treated. Some of them had obtained severe physical injuries, others still suffered from shellshock. The National Hospital for the Paralyzed and Epileptic in the London Bloomsbury district also accommodated civilian patients who had been severely affected by the war. So we can read in the hospital records about 35-year-old Grace. Although her husband had returned from the front, she had been so worried about him going to the war and breaking up her home that she had developed various physical complaints, headaches, back pain, and loss of appetite. She lacked motivation, felt fatigued, and was unable to concentrate. She had developed a mania for cleaning things, washing for hours at a time, and brushing things until they were nearly threadbare. Another female patient, 23-year-old Elizabeth, had lost her brother and husband in the war. With the day of the burial of the unknown warrior came the realization that there was no longer any hope of her husband returning from the war. Elizabeth descended into a deep depression, completely disengaging from the world around her, refusing food and treatment. These examples show that the story of Shellshock carried on for many years beyond the Great War. In April 1919, the British Medical Association had held their annual meeting in the Imperial College of Science and Technology to discuss the many valuable lessons from many terrible experiences of the war. Many doctors had seen the war as an opportunity to study the physical and psychological effects of modern warfare. Various war-related topics were discussed. However, Shellshock took the center stage. The attendees of the meeting agreed on several points. First, Shellshock was not a new disease. It was what neurologists had already known before the war and what was generally known as hysteria or neurasthenia. Second, men who developed Shellshock had an inborn weakness or vulnerability, which predisposed them to mental breakdown. Third, Shellshock could develop without any visible organic lesions. Soldiers who had never been exposed to combat developed Shellshock symptoms, and psychological therapies such as hypnosis or talking therapies could cure the symptoms. And finally, psychological mechanisms such as suggestibility and repression played an important role in the development of Shellshock. But yeah, what was Shellshock? How was it triggered and how did it present? We go back to the very beginning of the war, when the first traumatized soldiers arrived from the battlefields. The curious fact was that they had not suffered any obvious physical injury, and yet they were severely disabled. The first British Shellshock case treated at the National Hospital was Stuart B. from the London Scottish Regiment. The 18-year-old office worker had volunteered at the beginning of the war and was sent to the front in mid-October 1914. Doctors at the National Hospital took much interest in this young man. When he was admitted in late 1914, they documented Stuart's own account in the case record, which reads, and this is from the case record from the National Hospital in London: life in the trenches was very hard. There was considerable rain. They were not able to get water. The diet consisted of bully beef, jam, cheese, and bread. The sand would come into the food, and this increased the thirst. They had little chance to sleep. The eye strain was very severe. The patient had a great deal to do with handling wounded and dying soldiers, which made a deep impression on him. The first day he was in a trench, he had in his line of vision a pile of corpses, one of which had the face turned toward him and appeared to be sleeping. This made such an impression upon him that he cannot free himself of this vision. So Stuart, he was 5 days and 6 nights in the trenches at a stretch. The noises made by shells and the uncertainty of where they would strike caused great uneasiness and strain. Patients' comrades remarked that he did not answer when they spoke to him. Of this he knew nothing until told later on. He could not hold his weapon properly nor shoot accurately. He was very shaky, suffered much from headache. So he was sent away from the trenches in November and then arrived back home. And this was actually the end of his military career. When Stuart was admitted to the National Hospital, he complained of severe headaches and depression. He was granted a period of rest and received massages and pain medication. After 1 month, he was discharged from hospital with considerable improvement. The pictures of his dead comrades were never mentioned again. They probably haunted him until the rest of his life. So during and after the war, Until 1924, over 650 soldiers with shell shock were treated at the National Hospital. Each of them has his own story of suffering, a story which did not end with the cessation of fighting or discharge from the army. Most soldiers had developed symptoms after a shell explosion or burial at the front. Men who coped well and remained at the front line for extended periods of time were knocked out by the sudden blast. They collapsed. Some were blinded by the flash of the explosion. Some were deafened by the sound of the bursting shell. Most soldiers regained control of their limbs and senses within hours or days, but some suffered chronic disabilities, and when problems persisted, they were sent home to Britain, and 650 soldiers were treated at the National Hospital. The table shows symptoms of soldiers and of those soldiers who were treated at this institution. And as you can see, soldiers mainly suffered from motor symptoms. These are unexplained paralysis of their arms and legs, usually combined with a numbness in the affected area of the body. The other main symptoms included involuntary movements, as you can see here, in the form of shaking, tremor, tics, or abnormal gait. Soldiers showed the most bizarre gait patterns. They walked on their tiptoes or heels with stiff legs, crossing their legs scissor-like with every step, carefully sliding their feet across the ground as if walking on ice, or jumping as if springs were attached to their feet. Speech disorders, in particular stammering, were also relatively common. After the war, as you can see, these are the post-war cases. Soldiers were still shaking, walking in peculiar ways, and unable to use their arms and legs. These disturbances of movement had become paradigmatic for shell shock and the trauma of the Great War. So the most striking differences between symptoms during and after the war can be seen in the categories of functional seizures and visual disturbances. In the British soldiers, there is a threefold increase in functional seizures after the Armistice. Originally, functional seizures were seen as the archetypal presentation of female hysteria, and throughout the war, British doctors were reluctant or even refused to believe in their existence in able-bodied men. Reality forced them to change their mind. After the war, every fourth soldier with shell shock treated at the National Hospital suffered from fits, as you can see here. Visual disturbances were also a common phenomenon after the war. The loss or clouding of vision often seemed to be the direct consequence of witnessing violence, destruction, and death. It was as if the body tried to put up a protective shield against a sight too painful to bear. These soldiers underwent various investigations to rule out an underlying eye condition. Ultimately, the doctors had to conclude that these disturbances were a psychological reaction to combat stress. So one patient who suffered visual loss was 23-year-old Morris, who had been sent to Palestine, leaving a young wife behind. This is what is documented in his case record. In January 1918, he was transporting small arms up to the front trenches and sleeping at night in holes and caverns in the rocks. One night, after attending to the mules, he went to the cave to which he thought his friend had gone. He felt in the dark that someone was lying down on the floor. Thinking it was his friend asleep, he lay down beside him. In the morning, he woke up with the sun coming into the cave to find that he had been lying beside a dead Turk all night. The Turk had only been dead a short time, and his head was all bashed in. He staggered towards the door and passed out. On coming to himself, he found his sight was gone completely. It remained absent 5 days. Morris recovered his eyesight completely, and he even took part in the lightweight boxing championship of the forces in Egypt in April 1918, which he won. However, Morris could not escape his war experience, and his problems kept returning for many years after the war. When he was admitted to the National Hospital in 1923, he had a dead feeling in his whole body, weakness of his legs, and occasional loss of vision. So apart from debilitating neurological symptoms, soldiers faced many other challenges when transitioning from active service to civilian life. Many could not simply go back into their old lives because the situation at home had been transformed by the war as well. Children and parents had died, wives had found new partners. This is a scene at Victoria Station, again, this time during the war. Soldiers who left for the front line were depicted by the press as excited, radiant, cheerful and confident, while a sea of tear-stained faces watched their departure. So this is how many men returned from the war. It is no surprise that many soldiers could not bridge the gap between military and civilian life because these worlds were too far apart and the demands and pressures of civilian life too hard to fulfill. And the war continued in their minds. This is a quote by contemporary Scottish psychiatrist Maurice Nicoll. Consciously, the war was over, but unconsciously, for thousands of men, the war was not over. In their dreams, they find themselves back in the trenches, or they hear the drone of aeroplanes and see the flashes of bombs. Unconsciously, the war continues. So what lay between the leave train and the return to post-war life was the grueling frontline experience. The often romanticized view of men fighting for their country as heroes was blatantly at odds with the pictures and memories soldiers brought home. What they had witnessed was too difficult to talk about, and anything that reminded them of the horrors of war could trigger a mental breakdown. Many were in a state of increased alertness, continuously looking out for threats or dangers. Sudden accidental sounds, subconsciously reminiscent of battle sounds, caused startle reactions and generalized trembling. Sounds were the most common triggers for a relapse of symptoms and also for flashbacks, reliving of the combat trauma. Explosions in munitions factories here, for example, in Silvertown in London, and also Zeppelin raids caused very strong physiological reactions and intense emotions of panic, fear, and anger. Yet very minor triggers, for example, a door slamming or backfires from cars, could also bring on severe stress reactions. So already during frontline service, soldiers were struggling to bear the harsh conditions and the deeply traumatizing experiences of brutality, injury, and death. Some soldiers used strategies to blend out the unrelentless noises of the shells. Because they could not get away physically, they often escaped into a different mental space. In these dissociative states, soldiers were detached from their surroundings and sometimes even felt detached from their own bodies. Some soldiers drifted in and out of a semi-conscious state, often clinging to memories of their pre-war life and escaping in a more agreeable world. We learned from the case records of the National Hospital and the Charité how soldiers actually tried to cope with their trauma after the war. These were partly conscious, but mainly subconscious mechanisms. First, soldiers did not talk about their war experiences. They did not talk to their families because the realities of war were too gruesome to share. They did not talk to their comrades because they wanted to forget about the war. War-weary men tried to avoid every setting, every conversation or cue that might have taken them back into the trenches. Second, to block out their war experiences, some kept their mind continuously occupied. Others engaged in endless repetitive activities, working in the garden, exercising vigorously. Some of these behaviors might have structured the day and compensated for the loss of military routine after returning into civilian life. Keeping the lid on Pandora's box and trying to move on with normal life required much effort and willpower. Third, soldiers subconsciously produced a wide range of symptoms to avoid painful ruminations and images of their war experiences. Many soldiers described a state of mind that they called the complete blank or brain fog. These men drifted in a timeless space, somehow caught between their past and their future, but unable to bring these together and to move on with their lives. It was no coincidence that in many, the psychological trauma took a physical disguise. The somatic presentation was visible to everyone and a credible expression of suffering and distress. Furthermore, the therapist could focus on the recovery of lost function rather than engage in discussions on war experiences. In some hospitals, all conversation between patients or with visitors about the war was strictly forbidden, and patients were instructed to redirect their thoughts, for example, to beautiful scenery. And fourth, another way of blotting out the most traumatizing battle experiences was repression. Some psychologists argued that this was not per se a pathological process, but a natural way of coping with the unpleasant experiences. The traumatizing images were shut off from consciousness and inaccessible to memory. However, even if soldiers did not have any active recollection of the trauma, the suppressed material could still strike from the deepest layers of consciousness. The gruesome experiences often found their way back into the mind in flashbacks or nightmares, and some soldiers were reenacting battle scenes at night. And there was a big discussion whether soldiers should retrieve and face their traumatic memories, for example, under hypnosis, or shut them away forever. And most therapists were in favor of reliving these experiences and bringing them back to the patient's mind. However, for many soldiers, facing the trauma did not bring any relief, but a wave of unbearable emotions. Some experiences of war were so utterly terrible or disgusting, so wholly free from any redeeming features that nobody could be expected to face them. This quote referred to one of W.H.R. Rivers' patients, a young officer, and his trauma resembles that depicted in the film 1917, which you might have seen, where a British soldier, one of the protagonists, falls into a decomposing German corpse. Clearly, for some men, keeping a lid on the bogeyman was the only way to survive. Some experiences were so horrible that forgetting seemed to be the only option. And here on the picture, this is a photograph from 1916. You can see W.H.R. Rivers. He's a psychologist who worked with Shellshock officers at the Craiglockett Hospital in Scotland. Apart from their traumatic memories, soldiers transitioning into civilian life faced other challenges. For these men, the world had become an unsafe and threatening place. Danger was lurking around every corner, and nobody could be trusted. The men who came back from the war were not in control of their emotions. From the outside, their behavior often seemed to be erratic, and their outbursts of anger out of proportion to the triggering event. A conversation, a minor comment, or a noise could stir up some hidden sentiments and serve as the catalyst for rage, anger, and fury. The post-war newspapers are filled with reports of soldiers committing aggressive acts against others or against themselves. Many wandered the streets for hours or days in a semi-conscious state, not remembering what they had done when they returned home. So, many men had been longing for the day when they would reunite with their families. The thoughts about their loved ones and the prospect of reconnecting to their old lives were their lifeline in an unbearable situation. On the wartime postcards, we often see the romanticized picture of a loving wife waiting for her husband to return home from the war. The reality was different. Long periods of separation estranged many couples, and when their husbands returned from the war, physically exhausted and emotionally shaken, many wives found it difficult to reconnect to them and to the life they had shared before. So this is how a German wife experienced the return of her husband, as documented in the Charité records. She says, "We met in 1916 and got engaged. Then Bruno was sent to the front. When he returned half a year later, I did not recognize him. He was shaking so terribly, talking so strangely as if he had a stutter. He was very irritable, got terribly upset about trifles. He still fantasizes at night and during the day so that everyone senses that he is not right. When I sent him to the shop, he returns with nothing or random things, says he has forgotten what to buy or he loses his money. He's sitting at home, staring into space." So throughout the time of separation, women learned to cope without their husbands because of increasing labor shortages and pressures on men to enlist. The labor market had to be opened for female workers, and gradually women replaced all men who had been called up. Before the war ended, women had taken over typically male occupations. Many did extremely dangerous work, for example, in explosives and shell filling factories. Others volunteered to serve in the military in special women-only corps. In medicine, women were also allowed to work in regular hospitals for the first time. In the National Hospital, all male house officers were replaced by female doctors. One of them was Marjorie Blundy. You can see her here in this photograph, who had been a member of the Women's Hospital Corps. These women had set up a hospital for wounded soldiers in Paris, where they treated the most serious battle casualties. So, although the war opened a new world of possibilities for some women, for most women, war meant great hardship and sorrow. When their husbands and sons left for the war, it was the women's responsibility to care for the older and younger generations. Some husbands never returned. The war produced between 3 and 4 million widows across all combatant countries. Many men returned with mutilated bodies. They had suffered facial injuries, had lost an arm or a leg, were riddled with disease, or had simply turned into old men. Much worse for many of them were the often invisible psychological scars the war had left. In the Charité records, it is the wives who apply for the husband's war pension. It is the wives who put pressure on doctors to acknowledge the damage war had inflicted on their husbands' bodies and minds. It is the women who organize rehabilitation and who talk to employers to get their men back into work. It is the women who hold their families together and make ends meet. The case records portray women as the strongholds of their families and as pillars of society. Many of the husbands, who often could not speak for themselves, had lost their purpose and direction in life. Not much is known about the reactions of children to the return of their fathers, in particular when their fathers were physically injured or mentally disturbed. And this again is a case from the records, the London records of the National Hospital. This is about an 11-year-old girl, bright, intelligent girl, who had been expecting her father to return to their family home in London. However, when her father was discharged from the army blind, his arrival home in this condition was a shock to the little girl. And when she saw him, she threw up her arms. She screamed and kept on screaming. She fought and struggled for 3 hours. Louisa recovered from the initial shock, but then developed violent fits. Nursing staff observed that the little girl was very nervous, jumping violently at the least sound. So another major problem families had to face after the war was addiction. I was surprised to find so many cases of morphine addiction among the soldier patients of the Charité. The story was always the same. Soldiers obtained an injury at the front line and received their first shot of morphine in a casualty clearing station or a military hospital. Morphine not only suppressed any bodily discomfort, but also helped them sleep, calm their nerves, and made trench life bearable. Many soldiers never stopped using morphine and experimented with other substances such as cocaine, alcohol, and sleeping tablets, often long into the post-war years. The life of those men who came back from the war as addicts revolved around their drug consumption. Many of them could not work and spent their family's savings on drugs. Doctors and medical students were among the frequent users of morphine, often in combination with cocaine. They had easy and unlimited access to these substances. The Charité doctors took a special interest in these addiction cases and conducted a long-term study on the outcome and of their treatment. So between 1924 and 1930, all patients treated for morphine dependence were recontacted, and indeed, most case records include a response letter from the patient or from his relative. This is an extract from a patient letter. This young actor had started using morphine after an injury obtained during frontline service. Between 1970 and 1923, he underwent numerous detoxifications, but always relapsed afterwards. Then he decided to go on a long sea voyage. This is what he wrote in the letter to the Charité doctors. So he says, on the 5th of March, 1924, he went on a sea voyage without taking any morphine with him. Despite severe withdrawal symptoms, he says, I managed to get through these days working hard on the ship. When I arrived in Hamburg, the worst part was over and I found the strength to keep going. From March 1924 until today, I have not taken any morphine. I was a morphinist for 6 years from 1917 to 1923. I did 12 or 13 detoxes, and the only thing that helped me was my own cure. I never want to be a slave to these poisons again. And then he writes a letter again in 1929, and he seems to have, recovered from his morphine addiction. So, diagnostic labels, diagnostic labels, they were obviously relevant and ultimately determined the fate of the soldier and also his fitness for military service, his treatment, and eligibility for a pension. Diagnosis also became moral judgments, indicating to what extent the soldier was to blame for his own breakdown. In Britain, doctors and scientists had always tried to find an organic explanation for shell shock. They believed that microlesions in the brain or spinal cord might be responsible for shell shock symptoms. When they did not find any visible organic changes, they looked for physiological disturbances and hormonal imbalances. The search for organic lesions, which continued after the Armistice, was an attempt to absolve soldiers from the taint of mental breakdown and moral failure. So when I went through the records of the post-war period, it became less and less obvious that men with typical shell shock symptoms had served in the army and that their disabilities were related to the war. The term shell shock vanished from the records. Military ranks, regimental numbers, and names were abandoned, and civilian occupations appeared on the cover of the case notes, as if these men had changed their identity overnight. However, the most striking observation was that 1/3 of soldiers without any evidence of a physical injury or a medical condition received an official neurological or medical diagnosis. For example, soldiers with tremors and general slowing of movements were erroneously diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And you can see this category here. So after the war, 30% of soldiers received an organic diagnosis, although they didn't have any obvious physical injury or any organic changes. In Berlin, in Germany, at the Charité, soldiers with shell shock continued to be assessed for pension claims after the war. Most of them were diagnosed with a psychopathic constitution, an inborn weakness, which had supposedly led to their mental breakdown. This meant that war was ruled out as a causative factor for the ongoing symptoms and that they did not qualify for a war pension. In Germany, psychopathic constitution became the default diagnosis for traumatized soldiers. Although British and German servicemen endured the same battle conditions and hardships and by and large had suffered very similar post-traumatic symptoms, they returned to very different societies. As described in my book, the German welfare state provided generously for disabled veterans and integrated them into the civilian workforce. However, war veterans still lived on the margins of society as envied beneficiaries of the welfare system and unwelcome reminders of a lost war. And consequently, many despised the government and got caught up in extremist politics. They turned against a state that generously supported them. This is a photograph taken after the revolutionary riots in Berlin in March 1919. showing the broken columns of the National Monument. In contrast, British veterans battled on despite meager pensions and lack of statutory occupational opportunities, loyal to their king and country, enjoying the gratitude of the public and the status of the war hero. Initiatives by charities and philanthropists supported the veteran community and their families. For example, here at St. Dunstan's in London, which was founded by publisher and newspaper owner Sir Arthur Pearson. Pearson, who was blind himself, provided psychological support, rehabilitation, and training for veterans who had lost their eyesight in the war. Furthermore, the British culture of remembering and honoring their war heroes helped many to reconcile with their country and to bear the trauma of their frontline experience. In Britain, Shellshock would have a lasting legacy, and the concept of Shellshock lived on for many generations until today. It was part of the lived experience of a nation. So what was the contribution of medicine towards the legacy of Shellshock in both countries? As I've discussed earlier, in Germany, most men who had broken down in battle and became chronic invalids after the war were branded as psychopaths. German doctors believed that their weakness and abnormal tendencies predated the war and that the war was not responsible for their eventual breakdown. Consequently, German doctors left their traumatized soldiers without a pension and with a taint of a constitutional weakness. In Britain, the medical profession had difficulties to accept that seemingly healthy and able-bodied men could develop symptoms that resembled those of female hysteria. British doctors tried to find an organic explanation for cases of shell shock, a link to a somatic factor, and when this failed, they simply re-diagnosed traumatized veterans with a medical condition, for example, with Parkinson's disease. With their somatic approach and medical labels, they absolved their soldiers from the shame of suffering from a female disease and a mental disorder. However, by diagnosing medical conditions which were unrelated to the war, they deprived ex-servicemen of a pension and of a true explanation for their suffering. So, despite different approaches in both countries, all men who had fought in the war fell victim to the process of denial and forgetting that gradually separated the symptoms of traumatized veterans from the war. The doctors who were supposed to care for those who had sacrificed their physical and mental health for their country deprived them of what they perhaps needed most, a recognition that their suffering was a direct result of their war service. So by the beginning of 1921, medical interest in shell shock had vanished in Britain and Germany. With the burial of the unknown warrior, it seemed the discourse on war trauma was laid to rest as well. However, the nightmares, flashbacks, strange movements, and stutters remained. They persisted beyond the Great Silence and became part of civilian life. Many British and German case histories are very similar. This is the story of Charles from London and Erich from Berlin, who were both born in 1897, during a period of relative stability in Europe. Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee, and Kaiser Wilhelm, her oldest grandchild, saw Germany grow as an economic and military power. The future seemed bright for the two boys from working-class families who did well at school. However, when Charles and Erich came of age, the world had irreversibly changed. The two young men did what was expected from them. They joined their country's fighting forces and were soon sent to the front line. In 1918, both men were blown up by shells in France. They both developed shell shock and returned to their respective home countries. 20 years later, in 1935, both Charles and Erich were inpatients in their respective home cities. Charles, who was treated at the National Hospital, had never been quite well since being blown up in France. He always felt as if a rope was pulling him back and as if there was a steamroller on his chest. This is what is noted here in his case record. And he trembled violently when upset. Erich, the German soldier, had suffered frequent fits since serving at the front. He was completely dependent on his parents because of the seizures and frequent anxiety attacks. I could follow up his story until 1945. By then, his parents had died in the bombings of Berlin. 30 years after his war service, Erich still reenacted battle scenes from World War I. This is what I have also recently found in the medical case records of the Charité from the Second World War, where the trauma of the First World War was still relived and had a lasting impact on people's mental health. There are many other stories that should be told of the soldiers who were physically wounded, the men who returned with mutilated bodies or were riddled with disease, of the many civilians who suffered the consequences of war, and of the prisoners of war whose life came to a standstill and for whom the outside world often changed beyond recognition while they were in confinement. An estimated 80,000 British soldiers suffered from shell-shock. The medical case records from London and Berlin enable us to enter a world which, since the last veterans of World War I have passed away, is now inaccessible through living memory. It was the similarities rather than the differences between the case histories from Britain and Germany that made the most striking impression on me. In my journeys through the patient records of shell-shock hospitals in London and Berlin, I often encountered soldiers who were traumatized in the same battle, just on different sides of the front line. They had all witnessed immeasurable suffering and had been psychologically scarred, often for the rest of their lives. They were the victims of the epidemic of trauma that at some point threatened to overshadow all other medical problems of the war. These individual stories reveal the human condition, the basic human reactions to fear and loss that transcend all political and ideological differences. Thank you so much.
Stefanie, thank you so much for that. Would you like to stop sharing your screen, please? It should be, I think, at the top.
Of course, yeah.
People will be able to see us. So, yes, thank you very much for that. I mean, obviously, this is an incredibly difficult subject because I think that the stories that you're researching and the few that you've been able to share with us tell a very, very bleak story indeed, don't they?
Yes. Actually, while reading these stories for days on end while I was working in the archive, this had a great impact on me. And they are truly moving stories. And they show, I mean, obviously the deep trauma these soldiers endured, but also, you know, considering what they had been going through, their resilience. I mean, you know, many of them, if you look at, say, long-term studies after the war, many of them returned into their old jobs. Many were able to support their families. And I mean, I think this is something we have to mention as well.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I think it's also difficult though it may be. I think it's very important that we do remember these stories and learn the lessons. Hopefully one day we will learn the lessons that war is not necessarily an ideal situation. I think understating it. Just coming back to the phrase shell shock, I'm sensing from your talk that at the time, this was very much a catch-all phrase for a whole range of things that weren't that well understood by medical science. And I thought one of the things that you would talk about, the British doctors talking about the idea that men can suffer from a women's disease of hysteria. Yeah. I mean, I forgive me, I'm no doctor, but I sort of think of hysteria, something that, yes, I understand the sort of Victorian use of that word. I thought that would have been long since forgotten by the First World War. Yeah, but surprisingly, soldiers, traumatized soldiers showed very similar symptoms to women,
women of the Victorian era who were somehow traumatized as well, obviously, and they rather than showing obvious psychiatric or psychological symptoms, they suffered from bodily disturbances. So they had paralysis, they suffered from seizures, and in particular seizures were this really typical female presentation of hysteria. And so this was something British doctors didn't understand, and they really denied, as well in publications, that their, soldiers could actually suffer a similar disease. And then after the war, you see that there is, a steep increase in functional seizures. And it just seems to be a typical reaction to the stresses of combat and to this really immense, this really strong trauma. This is as well what I showed, that this very, very strong traumatic experience you get, at the front line in combat causes symptoms that are slightly different from symptoms that, develop after, long-lasting stresses, for example, work-related stress or, some viral disease or whatever. But these really, really strong stresses, they actually cause the loss of bodily functions, paralysis, seizures, involuntary movements, these very, very characteristic bodily presentations of trauma.
And of course, all of that would have been outside medical experience, as obviously this was also a new form of warfare as well, wasn't it? An industrial form of warfare.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So how did the research in Germany after the war and in Britain, how did it differ? Did the sort of two medical establishments come to different conclusions, or what was the sort of learning from there?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, obviously I couldn't go much into detail in this presentation. British doctors kept looking for some organic explanation for shell shock. So they looked for, visible lesions in the brain or spinal cord, or then, they looked at hormones and, some physiological problems. So they always wanted to find some kind of organic marker, some organic explanation for shell shock, possibly to absolve soldiers from this shame of, suffering from some mental breakdown or some female disease. And for German psychiatrists, it was very clear from the beginning of the war that these men were weak. They had some inherited weakness, and they were predisposed to break down in battle conditions. So they weren't eligible for a pension, and they were really responsible for their own problems. And so they had different explanatory models. The British and German psychiatrists or neurologists.
Okay, thank you. We've got quite a few questions here, so I shall start reading a few, which is good. Douglas says, thanks, a really interesting talk. As a great-grandson of someone whose great-grandfather fought on the Somme in World War I. David says, my granddad recently passed away last month, who served in the First and Second World Wars. He never talked about his experience in this awful time, showing how he coped by ignoring the past. I suspect that's quite a common refrain.
Yes. I mean, this is as well what I got from, meetings with, Western Front associations, and people who are more involved in this. I mean, I'm not a clinical specialist on war trauma, but this is what I heard from everyone, that people never talked about their war experiences, in particular when it comes to the First World War, because this would have, just led to a complete mental breakdown straight away. And, so people, what I said with Pandora's box, or, keeping the lid on the bogeyman, this required much effort, and people were really struggling to, keep that out of their lives. And they couldn't share it with anyone because nobody could really understand what they had been going through. And even, I don't know what it is today. I mean, I would maybe have many questions to the audience. even the soldiers, they didn't really want to talk about these experiences with their comrades. They just really blocked it out. And, they never wanted, they just wanted to block it out of their lives and never think about it again, because it would have meant a complete mental disintegration, mental breakdown.
Okay, thank you. Grant says, thank you for this insight into the horrors of the war. I have a question which might seem cynical. Do you think that the lack of support from each country is not just down to a lack of understanding, but sorry, it keeps jumping around because we've got more questions. Bear with me because sorry, Grant. Let me just refresh that. Do you think that the lack of support from each country is not just down to a lack of understanding, but a drive to not agree with the victim's suffering because of the associated cost of treatment? So I think what he's saying there, are they trying to avoid that cost?
Yeah, I mean, that I can, I can only refer really to the First World War and the post-war years. And in Germany, this was certainly the case, that people wanted to avoid the costs. And this is why, this diagnosis of psychopathic constitution as well, of an inborn vulnerability, was so prominent, because these veterans weren't eligible for a war pension. Definitely. In Britain, I mean, it's as well, it's not as easy as I explained in this talk. It's much more complex. In Britain, the veteran community relied very much on philanthropists and charities. But then 1 year after the armistice, there were other initiatives. For example, this King's National Roll Scheme, where veterans actually were employed, and there was more state support in the end. But obviously, the state tried to avoid too many pension payments.
I think that's interesting, because I think in Britain, to this day, many of the charities that were established, of course, to support those that had served during the First World War are still going today.
Yes.
And a lot of charities provide a lot of services in the United Kingdom, for sure.
Yes.
See if we can get through some of these questions. There are quite a few. Douglas, I suppose a lot of the shell shock must relate a bit to a very sudden overdose of adrenaline caused by combat in war zones.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, these were usually very sudden events, as I said, explosions, burials, and these very sudden events obviously had massive consequences for the body. As I said, people collapsed and they were usually unconscious for, a short period of time. So yeah, definitely there was much adrenaline involved. And some soldiers recovered from this initial, as well, freezing, maybe, or collapsing, period, and others, they had long-lasting symptoms. And
There's a comment from David here. I am an ex-serving person who suffers from PTSD from Iraq and Afghanistan, and struggle talking to my family about what I saw and felt. Obviously, that's sad to hear. But David, I hope you're getting the support that you need. If you're not, or if you just want to have a chat, please drop me an email. But thank you for sharing that, because I think what we're talking about, albeit in the First World War, there are still the same challenges today, of course, Stephanie.
Yes, and there was a big discussion, whether PTSD, already existed during the First World War. And, from the evidence I find in the case records, there already are similar experiences, these flashbacks, as I said, and even, the reenacting battle scenes at night. And this is and the whole discussion about either trying to forget these experiences and blocking them out, or facing them in therapy. I think that's still a very important question today, isn't it? And
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think also, with therapies, some therapies work for some people and don't for others. I think it's a very difficult, I think, to come up with treatments that are catch-all treatments. That's certainly what we hear anyway from the people we work with.
Yes, yes.
John says, Stephanie's research is actually helping some of what is happening here in Ukraine. Here, it's now drone shock, which affects soldiers and civilians alike.
Yes, yes.
That's interesting, isn't it? It's
Very interesting. Yeah.
the source of the, like you said, a certain type of sound or event, whereas drones, of
Yes.
course, are very dominant on the battlefield there.
Yeah, and it's the particular situation, isn't it, as well, in the First World War, the characteristics of trench warfare. That's a very unique situation, and this is sometimes now happening again in current military conflicts. And it's a situation of being completely out of control, completely helpless, and I think this contributes to the severity of the trauma. So I think that, there are many parallels, definitely. And I mean, I would have so many questions to the, veteran community as well when it comes to transitioning into civilian life, because there's many things that came up in the case records. I tried to kind of describe them, and there's so many more examples, obviously, of individual cases. But I was wondering if, these challenges are still similar today, or if, there are different challenges today when it comes to this transitioning process, or, that would be something I would be interested in.
I think from our experience, and I'm sure the audience can add their own comments to this, is that the way we would describe transitioning is it's more like a bereavement from, you're leaving the armed forces, your mates, possibly people you serve in combat with. And that transition, I think, is probably a bit more like a bereavement, to be honest.
Yeah.
And I think the other major challenge is the loss of sense of purpose.
Yeah.
If you've been in the armed forces and then you're struggling to find work, or you've got a less than satisfactory job. I mean, not wishing to get too much into gender here, but I think men do derive a lot of purpose from their work, and whatever that might be.
Yes.
But I want to ask the questions everybody else has got as well.
Yes.
So, but if anybody has anything, I would say to the audience, actually, if there's anything that you want to perhaps talk to Stefanie directly about, I'm sure she'd be happy for you to email her, but just send it to me in the first instance, and I can arrange all of that for you. Let me just catch back up where we were at. David continues. I think David, if I've got this right, yes, he's ex-service. I thought it was. David says, however, through counselling after 20 years, I've finally started to slowly heal, but it has taken a long time. I'm delighted to hear that, David, but the offer is still there, for as far as I'm concerned. Nathan says, an excellent talk. Thank you so much. It was insightful. It must have been so horrific for soldiers and loved ones to not feel heard or understood. The isolation must have led to so many suicides. Just shocking. David also says, do you think there was enough support then and now? Crikey, that's a bit of a question.
Yes.
I think from my experience, I would say support is better, but I still think there are plenty of room for improvement. And I do think, as whoever it was that mentioned about the drone warfare, I think when there are new forms of warfare, that leads to new problems, of course.
Yes.
I don't know what you would add to that, Stefanie?
Yes, no, I don't have anything to add. I was listening. Yeah, yes. Yes.
Max said, as a veteran serving in the Falklands, I found being open and honest about my experience helps. I totally understand and respect those that cannot speak about their own experiences. We are all different. I 100% agree with that. Douglas says, I think often it's the close families of veterans afterwards that have to pick up the pieces from big traumatic wars. Many after World War II tended to drink and smoke to help them cope with flashbacks and PTSD afterwards. In the UK, a lot of alcohol and cigarettes would be subsidized to help personnel cope with traumatic war zone experiences.
Yes.
Caroline also says, my grandfather was on the Somme and at Ypres, and on his return after the war, he was greatly disturbed by the lack of support for injured soldiers. Men having to sell matchsticks on street corners, for example.
Yes.
Also, my great uncle, an officer, had shell shock.
Yes. And it's obviously, it was obviously much easier if you had something to show, some injury. If you lost a leg, I mean, it's horrible to say, but it was easier. Many would have said that it would have been easier for me to lose an arm or a leg. These kind of invisible scars I have, this trauma which doesn't show to the outside world is the worst burden to carry around. And this is always with as well, after the war, the support for veterans. There was much support for physically injured veterans, blind veterans, and so on. But I think the Shellshock victims, they were always neglected, and nobody really wanted to deal with this, this issue. So yeah, there's still, different categories of injury, of war injury. And
but I think as you say, with mental health, you can never tell what's going by looking at somebody, what's going on in their head, can you?
Yes.
Okay, Carol overread that one. John says, yes, here we are. He's in the Ukraine. Here we are already experiencing them, Stefanie. The parallels with World War I are disturbing and uncanny. We are not prepared for what's coming, but are experimenting with a toolkit of different treatments, working directly with writing therapy here.
Yes, yes.
And Les says here, you've sort of touched on this, Stefanie, but he asks, how did the research affect you?
Yeah, as I said, you don't realize, you read through all these personal stories and all the details about the traumatic experience. I said, I was particularly touched by this 18-year-old man, who had to actually deal with corpses and, had this deep traumatic experience, which affected him most likely for the rest of his life. And these were deeply, as well, to be honest, traumatizing experiences. Even reading these stories, it made me feel very vulnerable and very upset. And, you have to take a break sometimes, really. And so...
Yeah, you have to be careful. It's vicarious trauma, isn't it? That's, when you're affected by other people's trauma. I think it's a very something you need to be aware of, especially when you're doing work like this. Few more questions. Mac says, do you think survivors' guilt played a part in the mental health issues of those returning from the battlefield?
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, just in relation to the First World War, I haven't come across this. I mean, although I have very personal accounts of, psychologically traumatized soldiers, strange enough, I haven't come across that at all, which, I never thought about it, but it's never been, it's never been a topic in the case records and in the very detailed letters as well. And yeah, no, I haven't come across this in relation to the First World War. I mean,
interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Richard asks, was there any evidence of triggers after the war, such as fireworks and perhaps louder noises in factories where people had no ear protection, for example?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, this is what I said. Sounds were the most common triggers for, relapse of symptoms and reliving of the war experience. And these could be, I mean, these were big things. Obviously, the soldiers returning to London, they were exposed to Zeppelin raids, to airplane raids. This was the most, the strongest trigger of a relapse of symptoms. And then there were explosions in munitions factories, but also very, very, as I said, very, just normal noises, a door slamming or something like that could really trigger very, very severe symptoms. And
Okay, someone else has asked, given the economic challenges facing World War I think you mean after World War I here, was Germany less able to support veterans? So obviously, the reparations and what have you after the First World War. Was Germany less able to support veterans, or did both the UK and Germany not do too much? In other words, could they have done more, I think is the question there.
I mean, I don't have the figures in my head now, but Germany spent much more money on supporting veterans, and there was a very good welfare system. I was surprised. I mean, most veterans, they had a right to work. They were actually accepted in their old jobs, and their workplaces were adjusted. They received generous pensions, even, their families, even say children born years after the First World War, still got some extra allowances through their father's pensions. So the German system was very good. But then, as I said, the German veterans were seen as beneficiaries of the welfare system, and people envied them because they were better supported than other people who didn't have a job, who couldn't, earn a living in difficult times. So, Germany was very good with that. But the veterans really turned against the state, as I said. It didn't work very well. In Britain, it was a different system. There wasn't so much financial support for veterans, and they struggled a lot. And they relied on charity, and this was very difficult as well, obviously.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stefanie. I'll squeeze in a couple of quick. I'll read through all of these as one. Stuart says, "Thank you for an excellent, meaningful talk. Have we really made much progress with regarding to mental health and warfare?" Before you answer that, thank you, Stefanie, for sharing these personal accounts. It has been really insightful to understand my own issues. Thank you for saying that, David. John also says, "Could you fill us in on a little on the research you were doing on World War II cases?" And thank you, and thanks to Duncan at Hellion Books, the book publisher, of course, which reminds me, thank you for that. I'm just going to post the link to the book for everybody is in the chat if you're interested. That's the most important thing. So just to quickly go back, I think one of those is a question.
These are very tricky questions, I have to admit. And
I'd say I would agree.
The first one you might be able to answer maybe much more insightful than I can answer that.
I think in terms of how we've made much progress, I think we have. But I do think the challenges can be, for some people, great, that we're still not really able to grapple the issues and the impacts of war. I think, like I said earlier, I think for some people, finding the right treatment is probably the hardest part, because it's definitely not one size fits all.
Yes.
Have we made enough progress? Probably not. I think there's still a long way to go, and warfare is ever evolving, and I think the challenges will be ever evolving. I hope that answers your question. I would just say there's been so many questions here. If you do have anything else that you want to ask Stefanie, please drop me an email. You'll have that from the invites you've had to this webinar. That just leaves me to say, Stefanie, thank you so much. It was worth all the technical issues, wasn't it, in the end? We got there.
All the stress at the beginning. Sorry. Thank you so much. No, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. And it's a real shame that I can't see the audience, because I would have liked, to connect with them in a different way. But I'd be grateful for any comments or any experiences. Please get in touch if there's anything.
Please. Yeah. And obviously, if you do more research in this subject area, please let me know, because when you publish your next book, we'll get you back on and talk some more about it. Thank you so much for your time. Lots of thanks coming in. I won't read them all, but everyone's very appreciative. Thank you very much.
Thank you.